Welcome and good morning, everyone. We'll be waiting just a few minutes to get started as a courtesy to those who will be still in the middle of connecting. Looking at this stage to start around 4 minutes past the hour. Thank you. Good morning, everyone, and thanks for joining us today and being part of our community. We have some great content planned for you, but before I start, I just want to go over some housekeeping items. Feel free to ask questions at any time by typing in the IM window. Be aware that anything you post will be publicly visible. If you prefer, you can post your questions anonymously by checking the box right below where you enter your question. We've had a large number of people register for today's webinar. We're thrilled to see the level of interest we have been through this series, but please bear in mind it may not be possible for us to answer a large volume of questions in real time during the session. We hope, or we have, people standing by to help answer the questions, and we'll do our best to answer as many as we can during the call. If you visit aka.ms/AIP Q&A, you'll see a post dedicated to this webinar series. We'll review the question transcript after the webinar and we'll post all further answers to that location. If you're listening to the recording of today's webinar after the event and you have a question, this is also the place to post your question. We are recording today's webinar and this will be shared publicly. There's been a lot of requests for this to be available to be downloaded. We have forwarded this to our community lead and we'll see what we can do to assist there. Our recordings are available as per the URL on the screen, aka.ms/AIP recordings. Talking of community, if you're not already signed up, do come and join us. The URL is on the bottom of this slide, aka.ms/security community. This is the best way to ensure you don't miss out on any future webinars. It's also where we post the majority of our major announcements and a place where you can interact directly with our engineering teams that are creating these security products. You'll be able to influence our product designs, get early access to changes by doing things like participating in private previews, requesting features, reviewing our roadmap, and of course, attending webinars like this one and also our in-person events. As I mentioned, we have some great content planned for today. Today's session is part 3 of a 6-part series on Azure Information Protection, or AIP for short. Throughout this series, we'll be walking you through all the major features of AIP and showing you how to deliver and configure each part. So I'd like to introduce you to the team on the call today. Ken will be presenting and is one of our resident AIP experts on the call. He's a program manager in our AIP team and part of what we call the Get to Production or GTP team. As part of his role, Hen is currently working daily with customers, helping them to deploy AIP, so he's well suited to help with today's topic. On the call, we also have Avi, Martin, and Adam to help answer questions. So with the housekeeping covered, I'll pass over Hen to get started. Thanks, mate.
Thank you, Adam. Can you hear me well?
Yep, from my side, perfect.
Great. So good morning, afternoon, depends on the location where you're sitting right now. Today we'll be talking about classification, labeling, taxonomy recommendation. First of all, my name is Chen. As Adam said, part of the customer experience team, came from the Secure Islands acquisition 4 years ago. So I already see some classification, taxonomy, and labeling pushed out through different kind of industries and organizations. And this is exactly what I would like to share with you today. To start with, let's look again for a second on AIP project phases. On the high level, there are different phases. You can split them out to different phases or section. But for the entire EMS or for the entire security product, you will see that we have the 4 main phases, which are the discover, classify, and label, protect, and monitor. And if we look through our webinar series, we started with the first session with Adam overviewing all the capabilities, the roadmaps, what was the history, what is the future, and so on. And from our last week webinar with Dennis, which he covered the discovery part. I will cover today the classify and label part to some extent. And in the next series, we will also talk about the protection and on the monitor section. So when we are looking on Azure Information Protection project, first of all, technically, it is easy. For everyone here in this call who tried to implement AIP, technically, it is not that hard. You need to install a client and you need to configure a policy in the web, and that's it. But the more tricky part would be to configure the right policy, to configure the right label taxonomy, classification taxonomy that will allow your information workers to start work with labeling and classification in a good way. So let's talk for a second on what is actually label, what is classification. So document classification is the ability to determine the confidentiality level of a specific document or information. Actually looking, it doesn't matter if it's automatic or a pair of eyes actually looking on a document and can find some information, sensitive information, and say, hey, this document is confidential or this document is highly confidential. This is exactly what we mean when we say classification. How do you do document classification? You will need to create or adopt classification taxonomy that will be easily understood by information workers across the organization. We will touch on this point later on in our discussion. What does it mean easily understood? Who created? Because we know that there are some customers and a lot of customers that already have some classification taxonomy defined for a long time. And in our call today, I will present to you also the Microsoft story, which we had for ages, our classification taxonomy defined and label defined. And Once we introduce AAP, we decided to change them. We'll talk on why we decided to change them and how. The second thing that you should do is identify different sensitive information types. And it takes me back to the discovery session that you had last week with Dennis. Now you can see the flow of what we're saying. On the discovery part, Dennis talked to you about you don't need to do anything just to be able to discover, to understand what kind of sensitive information types you have. Now we can take the sensitive information types that we have found and we can attach to them a classification taxonomy, a specific classification. For example, we have found a lot of information with PCI information. Now we will determine that everything with PCI information should be under confidential. So this kind of a mix and match will allow you eventually to train your end user or to make it easy for your information workers to think about classification and labeling. Hey, it's an annual report, easy, it's confidential. When we say label, we actually mean writing the metadata in the document itself, okay? Labels are metadata being added to the information to be able to enrich the information with some metadata, if it's the sensitivity, if it's the information type, and so on and so forth. This metadata, specifically for AAP, is written in clear text. It means that it can be leveraged later on in different exit points or DLP or whatever solution that can look for metadata and decide what to do upon this metadata. Those labels, the taxonomy, everything can be customized. We'll see later on. And when we are talking about classification and labeling taxonomy with respect to AAP, this is exactly what we are talking about. Try to envision what the end user will see now. Okay, with AAP, we are actually asking information workers to start handle information, to start classify and label. When today in our call, we will be focused on the parent labels. Okay, this will be our most of the call. This is where we decided the classification taxonomy, and this is what we would like to achieve as part of deploying AAP or going towards AAP deployment. As we said, one of the things that we need to identify is the classification taxonomy. And this is what we'll do today. I will give you the best practices, what we have seen in other organization, what we have seen in other industries. Small hint, doesn't matter the industries. Most of the industries and the customers start with something similar to what you see in front of your eyes. What you're seeing here, the Microsoft FT is, by the way, the Microsoft implementation. And what you see here underneath highly confidential, it's our sublabels. Usually sublabels will be used to apply protection. And this we will save for the next webinar next week. A little bit of example how it looks like. So what you have seen here is the current AAP client, AAP version 1 client that is in GA. What you're seeing here is the same label taxonomy or similar label taxonomy in Mac using the security and compliance integration and native Office integration. This is how it looks in Mac in Excel, and this is how it looks in Mac in Outlook. Everything that you see is already available. This is how it looks like in iOS. Okay, in this case, it's Android sensitivity labels. And this is how it looks in Outlook for iOS. It is coming soon. Okay, pay attention. Here on the top right, you will see everything that was up until now was already available now. And this is coming soon. And this is how it looks on the Android device. I will pause for 10 seconds to make sure if we have any questions from the audience. There is a latency for at least 30 seconds. So allow me 5 seconds to check our chat window to make sure if there is any questions that I should attend to. Okay. So this image I saved for the last. This is the AAP version 2, or sorry, AAP Unified Labeling Client. The AAP Unified Labeling Client. If you have seen, let me go back to the slide. And this client takes the policy from the AAP portal, Azure Information Protection portal. We will look at it very soon. And all the rest of the labels that you have seen in the next slide, actually taking the policy configuration and the policy and the label taxonomy from the security and compliance portal, including the AAP version 2 or AAP unified labeling. That is the new version that will replace the add-in, the current add-in that you have installed in your Windows machine if you have deployed AAP already. Now, I'll pause for a second and I will open the AAP portal and the security compliance portal. Reason is that I want to show you how easy it is and what kind of configuration you can do at the backend level. So we'll start with the AAP portal. You can just go by Azure Information Protection and you will find it here and you will be able to see all the labels. The first 5 labels that you are seeing, personal, public, general, confidential, and highly confidential, are the defaults that you will see. For each label, you can change the name, you can give the description, you can select the color. Color coding is very important to be able to point out for information workers, which is more restrictive. And you can associate protection actions for each template. Protection is a discussion for next week's webinar. We'll save it for it. And of course, here down below, you have the label ID. So what I wanted to show you here actually is that, let me do it following way, that you can decide the attribute of a label, the name, the color, the description, everything. You can even change everything that you see here later on as you move forward. The label ID will still be persistent. So the label ID is actually what's being applied. The label name is visualization. Label name can be changed later on if you want to do it. This is how you create labels, sub-labels, create, associate protection, and so on. Now let's look how it looks on the security and compliance portal. So the security and compliance portal, just to make a small aligning between all of us, the AAP portal is the place to configure and still to configure all the information and all the AAP policy. And once the Office team decided to develop the native integration of information protection, the policy configuration is being moved to the security and compliance portal. So at the long run, everything will be done from the security and compliance portal. For now, we keep using the AAP portal. From the AAP portal, from the AAP portal, you can go here to enable the unified labeling. One click on this button and the policy configuration, all the labels will be copied from here to the security and compliance portal here, protection.office.com. Here in protection.office.com, the security and compliance portal, you can go to classification, labels, and you will see the same labels that you are seeing in the AAP portal. You can see the display name, encryption, everything that you need. Easy as that. Okay. Moving forward. Sorry. So we've talked about the AAP portal and the SEC portal. The idea was just to show you how simple it is to define the labels, to define the description, the colors, what you can do, what you would like to change. Now let's do a little bit of a history lesson from the days of ADRMS till where we are here. By this history lesson, we will be able to understand What was the thinking process that made us to take those decisions to use the current classification taxonomy that you are using, or to use classification in total? So back in the days, we had ADRMS, well-known encryption infrastructure. Now, then the cloud came. We have constructed the Azure RMS, which is the cloud service of the ADRMS. And with respect to RMS in total, doesn't matter if it's ADRMS or Azure RMS, what we have found out that it was hard to train information workers to think about security in such a matter. With RMS, what you were able to do, and allow me to open. What you were able to do is to be able to pick an RMS template and to apply a protection using that RMS template. So if I'm taking here this Word file, for example, to be able to apply RMS template, you had to go to File, Protect Document, Restrict Access. Here I have a few bootstrap. This is why you're seeing multiple RMS service. But basically, you will see this kind of a list, and the information worker had to choose what kind of template he wanted to apply, what kind of protection. So this is exactly was asking too much from the information worker to do, to train them on what is protection, to ask them to think about security, to tell them when you want to apply protection, think about what you would like to apply, what kind of RMS template is applicable for you. Due to this reason, the too many clicks, it's hidden inside Office. It's talking only about encryption. It was hard to get traction with information workers. And actually, there wasn't that much of a high usage inside of a company. You were able maybe to get traction with few specific departments, but you wasn't able to get it across the full company. Then Secure Islands acquisition came, and I came from the Secure Islands acquisition. Secure Islands was an add-in that built on top of Azure RMS and inside for Office application and more, to make it easy for the end user to apply classification and labeling. And this is exactly what Microsoft adopted. And after the Secure Islands acquisition, we have formed the Azure Information Protection. So Azure Information Protection is rebranding of Azure RMS plus Secure Island Solution, IQP. The ability to apply classification and labeling, and based on this classification and labeling, take a decision on what action I would like to perform. The most obvious from AIP standpoint would be apply RMS protection. And this is what we are still doing. We have our classification and labeling. And with classification and labeling, the change of the story was that, first of all, it's in front of the information workers, in front of his eyes. Second of all, we do not care only about the information that needs to be protected or encrypted. We are actually telling our information workers, hey, from now on, you need to classify everything. But to be able to classify, we will make the classification scheme for you easy. When we are requesting from our users to start to work with classification taxonomy, then it's the first time that we are actually thinking about how an end user needs to interact, what actually he needs to understand from to be able to apply the right classification. We will review it once we will do the Microsoft classification story and some more. After Azure Information Protection was here, of course, just to complete the story, now we have the Microsoft Information Protection. Again, it's not a new solution. It's a story that now says all the solutions in Microsoft that would like to align to the information protection story is part of the information protection story. Okay, so to be able to explain you our thinking process and why we have chosen the classification story, I would like to demonstrate the Microsoft classification labeling story. So right after we talked about the Secure Islands acquisition and the forming of Azure Information Protection, When we formed Azure Information Protection, this was the labeling scheme of Microsoft. 3 levels, 3 labels, LBI, MBI, HBI. Low, medium, high business impact. When we started rolling out, or when MSIT wanted to roll out, they thought, this classification taxonomy, this labeling, when was it constructed? Long years, few years ago, more than few years ago. And when it was constructed, who was the audience? Who created it? Security folks, good. When the security folks created them, did they actually think about an information worker? Every information worker in our organization will actually need to handle day in and day out with this classification taxonomy? I can tell you that the answer is no. And it's true for all the organizations that I've worked with. I'm not saying that all the classification taxonomy that there is currently are misappropriate, but there might need some adjustment. And when they were constructed, they weren't constructed on the way of thinking process of how a simple information worker can handle. What can he understand from this classification taxonomy, actually? So the first iteration of the change from this 3 levels, we have changed it from 3 labels to 5. We call personal, public, internal, confidential, and secret. This is the first classification taxonomy that was introduced with AIP. Now that the security folks sit down and think, hey, what can be gelled well with our information workers? This is the first iteration. We personally, for me, it was as a newcomer for Microsoft, it was much easier for me to understand this kind of a label taxonomy from LBI, MBI, HBI. So we started with personal information, and personal information is talking about actually information that is not related to the business, and it's information that is related only for me as an information worker. That is, but later on we have the public. Public is well known with everyone. In the middle we have internal, and internal is an interesting one. I am tempted to start talking about internal, but I will leave it for 2 minutes from now. We have confidential and secret. First of all, just the names of the label tells me more than LBI, MBI, HBI. Of course, we have customers that you will see later on that had some coding to each of the labels. C1, 2, 3, 4 before each of the name, L1, 2, 3, 4 to be able to make the hierarchy. And this is an interesting aspect as well, because if we will look at our current classification taxonomy in Microsoft, this is how it looks like. And I will make the differentiation between each of the labels. When we are looking at personal versus non-business, you will see that personal is still in place for the default classification taxonomy offered when you create for the first time Azure Information Protection. We in Microsoft call it non-business because when you are talking from a company perspective on a personal information, especially when GDPR came into the picture, sometimes personal information can be understood as PII information. This is exactly what we have called it, to be called non-business, and allowing our information workers to save information as non-business. We still call it personal in our default classification, and the reason for it is that we are working with different kind of organization. Microsoft offers its services not only for companies driven by numbers and by money. We have organizations, we have schools, we have different kind of organizations that are not businesses, actually, they're organization, and this is why we are still calling it personal for the default one. Next is the public. Public is non-debatable. I think that it is well known across industries. We are seeing some customers that would like to expose public label to our information, and some says no, public information, it's just for specific departments can set up documents and information as public. With internal is a very interesting one. With internal, we are seeing it almost in a lot of organization. We had it in ours as well. Internal, and you see it that it's right in the middle. Because it's right in the middle, it's the default level of classification by definition by our information protection policy. And because it's the default information, the definition says in the description, this is the day-to-day information. It can be shared with internals and externals, and it doesn't need to be encrypted. When we are saying it can be shared with externals, but the label name internal, this is exactly the feedback that we have got from our information workers who said, hey, listen, it sounds to me a little bit awkward to send something outside that is classified internal. Exactly due to this feedback, we have changed the name to be called from internal to general. Makes sense. When I'm talking about this point with my customers, all of them understand this concept. They say, hey, makes sense. The problem is that changing classification taxonomy takes some time, more time internally to decide to change the label in the label taxonomy. We'll talk about how to handle it later on. Confidential, we had confidential, it's still confidential. And the only change that we have done is from secret to highly confidential. So the reason that we have changed secret to be called highly confidential is that we have done some testing and we said, what is the few most important stuff that we want from our classification taxonomy? One of them was, I want to make sure that all my employees can order from the least confidential to the most confidential label. When we had the previous classification taxonomy, some people got mixed between secret and confidential. What is more restrictive? When it is highly confidential and confidential, no one made a mistake. This is why I said a few minutes ago that some customer even said a prefix for each of the label to be called C1 or L1, 2, 3, 4, and then the name of the label. Just to be able to go over the label description and the overall goal of each label, non-business is data that we took here as the example of Contoso, is data that does not belong to the company. Data does not need to be encrypted and cannot be tracked and revoked. And any personal data which is collected is belong to Contoso. Public information is well known. This is the information that is already made public. You can go and post it on social medias and whatnot. And this is exactly the differentiation between, or the major differentiation between public and general. By policy and by information protection, what we are seeing in Microsoft and outside of Microsoft is that non-business, public, and general information does not need to be encrypted by definition. They can be, it is not mandatory. So the ask is, what is the difference between public and general if both of them does not need to be encrypted? The difference is that public information is allowed to be shared on social medias and outside. General information is business data, and it doesn't mean meant for public consumption. Maybe yet, maybe not forever, but it doesn't meant for public consumption. It can be shared with internals, externals, and so on, but on a mindful manner. And of course, the important part is that everything here is based on confidentiality. Confidentiality can be mapped out and should be mapped out to an impact on an organization. What happens if I will lose a public document? What happens if I will lose general document? What happens if I will lose confidential document? This is exactly the thinking process that there is behind the confidentiality levels. And when we have this kind of a discussion, we can later on decide, okay, confidential and highly confidential information are sensitive information that if I will lose any of them, they will trigger impact or a great impact. If I will lose public document, there is no impact because it's already public. And if I will lose general information, there is minimal impact to almost none. This will be the day-to-day communication. So we've talked about public, general, and confidential and highly confidential. Those are the more restrictive, more sensitive, business related that we say that by definition, we want to have them also protected. What can be protection action? Encryption. We'll pause for a second to check if there is any questions. Okay. So I've shared with you, and again, just to be able to put it in front of our eyes, the Microsoft story. We have started with 3 levels of classification, LBI, MBI, HBI, that was hard to train information workers and to make it, excuse me, and to make it widely spread across the company. We have changed it to something that is more explicitly understood by information workers. We had iteration 1. We have deployed the client with the classification taxonomy that you have seen here. And actually, by the feedback that we have got from our pilot users, we have gone and changed it to the current classification taxonomy that I have to say makes sense for me. We are still using it. I'm not saying that it is perfect, but it is definitely a nice way to see the gradual changes from the 3 levels to the first iteration of 5 labels, starting the deployment of the IP client with friends and family and some business owners to get the feedback and collect the feedback, and based on the feedback, eventually have something that is much more robust and makes sense for everyone in the company. So we talked about the Microsoft taxonomy, and I would like to show you some other examples that we have seen across different industries. As I said, you might see prefix of L1, 2, 3, 4, or C1, 2, 3, 4 between the labels. We have seen public restricted confidential secret, public internal confidential secret, and so on and so forth. You will see that what we've found out that across industries, there are some similarities, okay? And we can offer, using our best practice and using the Microsoft recommendation, and by the way, you will see that the Microsoft recommendation is attached to the Microsoft deployment because we are in this business for a long time and we have seen lots of customers deploying. What we can say is that there are similarities. You can change the classification. You should check what is your classification taxonomy that is approved currently and check if you can use it in your deployment. We are seeing some using restricted, some using strictly confidential between highly confidential. All of it is more of the same as long as you feel comfortable with this classification taxonomy and you say, my organization knows this classification taxonomy, you are good to go. You can again start the deployment with what you have, collect the feedback, make sure that it is understandable, and if you need to make any modification, changing label name is easy. As I said at the beginning, it's just the name, the label ID behind it, still the same. So we would like to continue with our best practices recap. So the classification taxonomy should identify the confidentiality level of the document. This is what we have found that works best with respect to information protection. You can of course make different kind of taxonomies, but confidentiality level made the most sense. And this is what we have seen highly adopted across different organizations. Based on the confidentiality level, as we said, we have the public, general, confidential, highly confidential. What you will need to do is only to train your information worker what counts as public, what counts as general, which is the day-to-day, what counts as confidential, and what is highly confidential. Later on, the user just need to understand that, okay, annual report equals highly confidential. So we will pick highly confidential. I do not need to train him anymore about protection, about encryption. I just need to train him about my classification taxonomy and what kind of information types falls under what kind of category. Then when he chose confidential, automatically I will apply the right kind of protection measures. The most straightforward, as I said, with AAP would be to apply encryption. But as we roll along the Microsoft Information Protection story, you will see more and more integration and more things that you can do based on the labels. If it's using MCAS to identify the label and take action, if it's using any kind of DLP solution that can look on the metadata of the file. It doesn't need to look anymore inside, just the metadata of the file to see that it's confidential or highly confidential and then act upon it, and so on. A recommended classification taxonomy would be one that is every information worker will be able to order from the least restrictive to the most restrictive. As we said, if I will need to jump in back for a second to other classification that we have seen. And again, personally, I'm speaking. The difference between restricted and confidential sounds to me out of the blue. If someone will ask me what is more restricted of confidential, I wouldn't know. What helped me out in this example is the prefix of the numbering. We can see here, this is an example for a classification taxonomy that is being proposed by one of the governments and one of the government agencies. I have to say that this kind of a classification taxonomy is a little bit hard for me to comprehend. What is the difference between official, secret, and top secret? And for those kind of customers, we're engaging with a discussion to try to understand how, and what we are doing is asking leading questions. How will you explain it to your information worker? What category, what information types falls underneath each of them? Do you feel comfortable with it? And of course, what we are always saying, okay, if you feel comfortable, good, go test it out. Collect the feedback, and based on the feedback, you will see if you got it right or wrong. Of course, and this is related to this point that I've just talked. With some of the organization, and again, including Microsoft, we have adopted the internal label, part of the taxonomy. By definition, internal does not need to be encrypted. It's okay, this is what we had. And internal is an old statement from 10, 15 years ago where everything was, or the external sharing wasn't here that strong. So we had only our parameter. We said internal is internal, all good. Now when we are collaborating externally a lot in electronic ways, calling information internal is not, first of all, it's not confidentiality level. And second of all, it limits the information or the way that information worker can handle such document. Because by definition, in most organizations, internal is the default classification, and it is actually allowed to share this kind of information outside. So again, we in Microsoft changed from internal to be called general, and on this specific topic, in every conversation that I have with my customers and I explain it, they say, hey, listen, it sounds 100% makes sense, but we have now a problem where this is our defined classification taxonomy, and this is what we'll start with. And I'm saying, okay, start with it, collect the feedback, and if anything needed, just change it along the way. Information protection projects are a journey. They are not one-time projects. The 4 phases that we have talked about: discover, classify, label, monitor, protect, and monitor, they are in cycle. You are doing phase 1, and then phase 2, and then start over. And then you are starting with a simple taxonomy. and then you are adding more labels, you are getting feedback, and so on and so forth. And although we are recommending to adopt the Microsoft classification taxonomy, your classification taxonomy might be slightly different from what we are recommending to you. We know that it is sometimes hard to open discussion to change classification taxonomy. As we said, you can and should start with what you have now approved. Of course, if you can approve it in a nice manner, or if you think that you should adjust it, do it. There is no reason to wait. But if you feel that it will stall your project, that it will stall the ability from you to achieve classification and labeling project, and of course protection added value from immediate, start with what you have, collect the feedback. Feedback won't lie. If information workers would not like the classification taxonomy, and it will be hard for them to use it, one of the things will happen, or either they will not use it at all, or you will see strained usage for your taxonomy, where people will be mixed up. You will get, of course, a lot of questions and feedback. Next is, if your organization, of course, doesn't have any classification taxonomy defined yet, use our Microsoft recommended one. If you are a business organization, we are also recommending you to change the personal label to non-business label. And the next 3 best practices is actually talking about somewhere between the technicalities and the policies. When we are creating a policy and when we are deploying information protection solution, we can define to have a default level of classification, meaning every document that we are now creating or all documents we are opening will have this default level of classification. We highly recommend to use this setting, and moreover, we highly recommend to use general or internal, again, depends on the convention that you are using, to have such a label. The reason that we are recommending it is actually we are now introducing new solution for information worker. And what we would like to do is to minimize as much as we can, the friction with the end user. We're a security product. Not all information workers, I wish we had, but I know that it's not the case. Not all, if not most of the information workers doesn't really care about security, and they doesn't think about security. We will only be able to be successful. You will only be able to be successful if you will make it easy for your information workers to think about security. The ability to make it easy is to have a clear policy, a clear label taxonomy defined, and to minimize the end user friction by using settings like set a default label. Because even in Microsoft and in other organizations, most of the information workers does not handle confidential or highly confidential, especially on their day-to-day job. Most of the information workers handle general/internal information. And we do not want them to be prompted with the ability to apply classification day in and day out for every document instead of when they are working on general information. Instead, we will use this kind of a setting that will put a default label for them. They will still have the ability to change this classification to anything else that they wish. But at least we will have a happy customer, a happy worker, that we are not overburdening with security. Next one is the user must provide justification to set lower classification. This is a very classic one where we are saying, hey, if anyone changing classification and lowering classification, I would like to know what is the justification, why this information worker has done it. Of course, everything, all the justification requests are being logged and audited. Wink, wink for our 4th webinar, or the 5th actually, but the 4 in our four phases. Definitely recommended to provide justification and to be able to log and understand who is doing what. And Last thing that I would like to talk about is the end user training. We cannot expect, of course, for an information worker to know what to do without the end user training. But the beauty part is that if you are starting small and simple, if you are starting with taxonomy that makes sense for the information worker, if you are starting with something that is not too restrictive, you will be able to find, to create a small amount of end user training, and I will give it some few examples very soon. You will be able to train your users without too much. If you find yourself need to create too many materials, too many matrix to explain what will happen when an information worker will click on a button, then probably you have started your deployment with a too complex policy. If it's a too complex, it will not be easy for the information worker to use, and eventually what will happen that the information worker will not use AIP. Some examples of end user awareness. When we have decided to change the classification taxonomy, we have put down this kind of a posters to make awareness. Classification taxonomy, this is the labels, information protection. Know your labels. We had even one that says new labels are coming. We are retiring the old LBI, HBI, MBI. This is the new taxonomy, and so on and so forth. This kind of marketing materials was sent out, was printed out in our campus. It was even digitally added to the splash screen for a few of the login screens that we have here internally, and so on. I want to show you a few examples again on end user communication that you can and should use. And everything that I'm showing here today is of course available on online. We have made it available for you. This is an example for end user training. It's four pages where we are explaining the label taxonomy. We are giving an example of how it looks like. What is our label taxonomy? What is the impact of each label? What will happen if a user will choose this label? What can he expect from the recipient side to be able to do? Some few use cases for each of the labels that we have. And of course, some support link and so on and so forth. This is one example. Another great example. Let me find it 1 second. Another great example is to have a matrix between the classification of each of them. Identify what is highly confidential, what is confidential, and so on, and just map out between specific information type to what is the confidentiality level. Then it will be much easier for the end user to understand, okay, this kind of information types equal public, this kind of information types equal confidential, this kind of information types equal highly confidential. To finish up, I want to point out that all of what we have talked about is being discussed in our AIP deployment acceleration guide. You can get it from https://aka.ms, AIP DAG. And for end user awareness materials, you can go to aka.ms/MIP files. And that's it. Now I think that we will be open for Q&A for the last 5 minutes.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Ken. That was a great session. So a couple of things that kind of came up through the Q&A session as we've gone through so far was you made reference to AIP v1 and AIP v2. We've talked about unified labeling. Did you want to just spend a minute explaining how that all fits together so that we can make sure we've not confused anybody?
Yes, definitely. Is there any other questions outside of this one?
Yeah, absolutely. There's one I'll hit you with afterwards, but I thought that'd be a good starter for 10.
Okay. So I will try to get my pen and try to draw something out. Maybe we can start with the other questions while I'm drawing something.
Sure, absolutely. So I think another good one which came up, and it's kind of common, and we've documented this in our docs as well, and the guys answered it pretty well in the chat, was that, you know, there's some logic around what file types we support when we talk about classification, and the fact they're mostly Office related. And I just wonder if you want to spend a minute expanding on, you know, what's the requirement for us to support classification and why it seems to be predominantly Microsoft based.
When we are talking about classification, is the ability to apply a label, or
Absolutely.
we're talking about automation? Okay.
The labeling predominantly.
Okay, so the ability to apply a label is actually determined on what kind of file we are handling. With Office files, it is easy because there is the custom properties where this is exactly what it was built for, to be able to add more metadata. If we took an example of a TXT file, for example, there is no header. It is not complex file. There is no way to add more metadata. So for the files that we can add metadata, for the complex files, we are doing it. And if you have any other request for a specific file type that we can add or we should add, let us know and we will make sure that we will evaluate it. For now, what I can say is that we are supporting for classification and labeling most of the file types that we have heard that are needed. And for the ones, I will give again the example of TXT file that are not compound, we can apply label for everything that is protected. Technically speaking, if I'm applying encryption, I am encapsulating or putting the document inside some of a wrapper. I can use this protection wrapper to put my label. So I can apply labels for protected TXT, but not for unprotected TXT. I can apply, for example, a label that will be called confidential. You know what? Even better. So I can apply labels on TXT. I think it's stuck. So I can apply labels I can apply confidential label on a TXT file and it will be good. But if I will try to apply a label that does not trigger protection on a TXT file, it will not apply because I don't have where to host this extra metadata. Bottom line, if you have any specific requirements for a specific extension, let us know and we'll evaluate it.
Perfect. I think to add to that is, obviously it needs to be a file format that's owned by somebody. So if we look at Adobe, they own the PDF format. They're able to effect a change there. There's talks with Autodesk, around the CAD side of things. So that really helps too.
Definitely.
Cool. So really it's just that V1 and V2, I think, and then I think we're good to close out again.
Okay, so 1 second, V2, and I will put it like here. Sorry. Okay, so we just scratch it out. And what Okay, now I'm back. Sorry, I got disconnected for a second. So what I want to point out is we have here AAP v1, AAP v2, which is called the unified labeling, and the SDK, which we can look at it, the MIP SDK, which we can look at it. This is what is using.
If I just interrupt for a second, can you reshare your desktop? Because I think the screen's gone blank.
You're right. Your source. Correct. Just acknowledge when you can see it.
Yep, I think that should be back up.
Great. So this is the AAP portal. This is the security and compliance portal. This is the AAP client version 1, version 2, and SDK. Version 2 equals unified labeling. Okay, this is the name of the unified labeling. When we started AAP, we had only the AAP portal and the add-in, the plugin for Office and for Office for Windows, and the right-click experience for Windows integration. When we wanted to integrate natively inside Office, Office said, okay, now the policy will be hosted in the security and compliance portal to be able to later on expand it to the full Microsoft Information Protection story. If it's SharePoint that will take from there, if it's Exchange that will take from there, everything, all other solutions will take the policy from here. So this articulates the copy of the labels, the policy from the AIP portal to the security and compliance portal. And once we have copied the labels from the AIP portal to the security and compliance portal, now other clients like the AIP v2 or unified labeling, the Office native integration, the Adobe native integration, and so on can start take the policy from the security and compliance portal. So all the images that I have showed for iOS, Android, Mac OS, taking the policy from the security and compliance portal. The AIP portal and the security and compliance portal are currently in GA, both of them. The migration process itself is still in preview. It will soon be GA. And the AIP client version 1 is in GA. The AIP client version 2, aka AIP unified labeling, is in preview. It will become GA very soon. And the Office native integration are out there in production already for specific versions of Office.
Excellent. Thank you much for drilling into that. Do you have that last slide available so we can put that up for the attendees?
Yes, exactly.
So thank you very much, everyone, for today. Just final reminders, if for some reason you don't have the rest of the series, you can find it at aka.ms/AIP webinar. You can find the recordings as you see on the slide as well. And please, if you haven't already, come join our community at aka.ms/security community. Thank you for joining us today, and thanks for being part of our community. Thanks, Hen, and we will see you again next week.
Have a great week. Bye-bye, everyone.